"I'm not going to date an unemployed man, John." That's what she said, without flinching, while I was still wearing the same suit they fired me in. It hadn't even been an hour since I walked out of the office, box in hand, after 4 years of loyalty. I hadn't processed the shock yet. But Nancy had. In fact, it felt like she'd been waiting for this moment. We were sitting at that little sidewalk cafe near 7th Avenue, the one she always said made her feel urban. She stirred her overpriced iced latte like she was trying to distract herself from my reality. "I just think," she said, not looking up, "maybe it's time we took a breath." I watched her fingers tap against her phone screen. No trembling, no hesitation, just detachment, clean, practiced detachment. That's when I realized, this wasn't spontaneous. She didn't dump me because I lost my job. She'd been waiting for the first excuse to leave. "You said we were building a life together," I said quietly. "I also said I didn't want to drown with someone," she snapped, eyes finally meeting mine. "You're a good man, John, just not a man with a future anymore." I didn't argue. There's no point trying to reason with someone who's already rewritten your role in their life. The waiter came by, asked if everything was okay. I nodded. Nancy didn't respond. She was already unlocking her phone again. "Will you be okay?" she asked suddenly, almost as an afterthought. It stung more than it should have, not because she asked, but because it was so casual, like she was asking if I needed a napkin. "I'll be fine," I said. It was a lie, of course. I was 32, jobless, and had just been dumped by the woman I thought would stand beside me during the worst parts of my life. But I said it anyway, because I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked away without looking back. I sat there for another 15 minutes, just staring at the coffee she didn't finish. That was the last time I saw her in person. The week that followed was quieter than I expected. No texts, no messages. My phone only lit up with spam emails and LinkedIn rejection notifications. People at the office probably thought I'd taken a sabbatical. No one called to ask if I was okay. I wasn't. But I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. On the 6th day, I pulled out my old resume, updated it with fake enthusiasm, and started applying again. Dozens of applications, dozens of polite rejections. Until one evening, I got a call back. The voice on the other end belonged to Brian, CEO of a rising tech firm I'd always admired but never imagined working for. He didn't sound like a recruiter. He sounded like someone who already knew me. "John, right? Former ops manager at Carlton? Heard they let you go. Their loss." I blinked. "You heard about that? Word gets around, but that's not why I'm calling. I read your product strategy white paper last year, been waiting for the right excuse to poach you ever since." My pulse picked up. "You're offering me a job?" Brian chuckled. "I'm offering you something better, a fresh start." We met the next day. His office was smaller than I expected, but his handshake was firm and the contract was real. He asked me one thing: "Are you ready to rebuild everything from scratch?" I said yes. I didn't ask about the salary. I didn't care. 2 weeks later, I started the new role. The team was lean, hungry, sharp. I kept my head down, did the work, and stayed quiet. Until I walked into the Thursday strategy review and saw Nancy sitting at the conference table. She looked up. Her face went pale. I didn't say a word. I just took my seat, opened my laptop, and acted like I didn't recognize her. Because now, the man she once walked away from had just walked in as her new boss's right hand. John wasn't the kind of man people remembered at first glance. In meetings, he was the one taking notes, not talking. At dinner parties, he stood by the window instead of working the room. He didn't dress to impress. He didn't speak just to be heard. But for those who paid attention, really paid attention, John left an impact that didn't fade. At 32, he had finally carved out a quiet, respectable space for himself in the corporate world. Nothing flashy, nothing viral, just quiet competence and a reputation built on consistency. He had been the operations manager at Carlton Logistics, a mid-tier company with higher aspirations than actual reach. For 4 years, he'd been the one people called when things broke, stalled, or needed solving. Never the loudest in the room, but always the one who actually fixed the mess. His days were long, his evenings solitary, but there was comfort in rhythm. Predictability suited him, chaos didn't. and if there was one thing that had always been chaotic, it was Nancy. He met Nancy 4 years ago, at a co-worker's engagement dinner. She was a friend of the bride, a last-minute RSVP in a backless emerald dress that made half the room stop talking when she walked in. John had spilled wine on her by accident. She laughed, called it a sign, and asked if he'd buy her a replacement drink to apologize. She chose bourbon. He chose not to argue. That night, they didn't flirt, they talked. She told him about her job in marketing. He told her he'd just been promoted. She teased him for using words like logistics optimization. He told her she looked like someone who got bored of people fast. She laughed. And somehow, from that first night, Nancy became a permanent fixture in his life. The beginning was warm, bright, borderline cinematic. Nancy was spontaneous, always dragging John into pop-up art shows, underground music bars, or midnight taco hunts in neighborhoods they didn't know how to pronounce. She was opinionated, dazzling, a bit reckless, and she seemed to like that John wasn't. "I like men who are predictable," she once said, lacing her fingers through his. "They're the only ones who can survive women like me." He smiled, thinking it was romantic. Now he wondered if it had always been a warning. Their first year together felt like living inside a Sunday morning playlist, soft, indulgent, and easy. But slowly, things began to shift. It started small. Nancy started sighing more, complaining more, commenting on how John always wore the same jackets, how he'd rather cook at home than try the new influencer-backed Korean-Mexican fusion place downtown, how he never posted about her on Instagram. He didn't argue, he just watched her drift, first emotionally, then physically. She started going out more without him, said he didn't need to come to every event. "You wouldn't enjoy it anyway," she said with a gentle smile that masked the distance. John wasn't blind, he saw it, he just hoped it would pass. But it didn't. The third year was colder. Nancy became increasingly obsessed with optics. She wanted to be seen, celebrated, validated, and John's quiet life didn't offer enough flash. He started seeing the way her gaze lingered at parties, how she seemed to measure the men she met by their watches, their shoes, their LinkedIn bios. He told himself she just needed time. When Carlton's profits dipped and rumors of restructuring began, Nancy's patience thinned. She started bringing up plans, timelines, where this relationship was headed. She wasn't wrong to want those answers, but she wasn't really asking. She was assessing, weighing. And John? He was still trying to hold it together, for her, for himself, for the life they were supposed to be building. When the firing finally happened, an abrupt HR decision, budget cuts, no personal faults, he hoped she'd sit beside him and say, "We'll figure it out." But instead, she said, "I'm not going to date an unemployed man, John." That line stayed with him longer than her perfume ever did. John wasn't angry, not exactly. He didn't have it in him to rage or plot revenge. That wasn't who he was. What he did have was silence. The kind of silence that builds walls no apology can climb over. After Nancy left, John pulled back from everything familiar. He unsubscribed from newsletters, blocked her on socials, and even changed the walking route he took every morning. He couldn't afford a therapist, so he let long walks and late-night drives do the work. He cleaned out his fridge, deleted her photos, returned the sweater she'd left behind to the donation box without touching it. And still, on some days, her voice echoed louder than he liked. He wasn't shattered, but he wasn't healed either. The thing about being with someone like Nancy is that you never get to hate them outright, because in between the damage, there are still too many good memories. Too many shared secrets that still feel like yours, even when they're not. Nancy wasn't a villain, she was just unfinished. A woman who mistook momentum for loyalty, who only knew how to love a version of John that had upward motion, not downward pauses. And John? He was the kind of man who didn't mind staying still for a while, as long as he wasn't standing alone. 2 months after the breakup, John had stopped expecting anything good. He wasn't bitter, just tired. The interviews were going nowhere, the economy was merciless, and the nights were too quiet for a man who used to have someone humming in the kitchen while heating up leftovers. Then came a call from Brian. The man's voice was confident, fast, and amused. He didn't waste time. He said he'd read one of John's internal memos on streamlining back-end distribution through regional warehouses, said he was impressed, said he liked people who don't talk too much in meetings but get things done when no one's watching. John said yes before even hearing the full salary offer. When he showed up at the office, things were different. The culture was more aggressive, more fast-paced. People here moved like they had somewhere better to be, but John was ready. The setbacks had carved a sharper edge into him, quiet, but harder than before. What he didn't expect, what he couldn't have expected, was to walk into a quarterly alignment session and see Nancy seated across the table. She was in a fitted blazer, red lipstick, hair perfectly set. Her eyes widened the moment she saw him, but she quickly masked it with that same polished smile she always wore when things weren't going her way. John didn't smile back. He didn't need to. Because this time, he wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't the one hoping to be enough. He was the one who'd been chosen, by the man who now signed her paychecks. He sat down, opened his notes, and gave his report like she wasn't there at all. That was John. The man who got left behind, and then quietly outranked the one who left. John wasn't supposed to speak at that meeting. He'd only been with the company for 2 weeks. Technically, he was still onboarding, but when the head of product fumbled through the Q4 rollout numbers and no one could answer Brian's follow-up question, it was John who broke the silence. "We can't expand distribution to 4 new regions without restructuring the cold chain logistics first," he said evenly. The room stilled. All eyes turned to him. Brian, seated at the head of the table, raised an eyebrow. "And?" John didn't fumble. "The cost per delivery will double unless we reduce last-mile duplication. If we consolidate vendor routes by district before onboarding, we can cut the increase by 42%. The head of product stared at him, stunned. Brian grinned. "There's our man." Everyone nodded, everyone except Nancy. She didn't speak for the rest of the meeting. She just kept flipping through her notes, her pen still, her lips tight. When the meeting ended, John stood up slowly, waiting for her to glance at him. She didn't. But as she passed, she muttered under her breath, "Didn't take long." He let it slide. For now. The days that followed only deepened the discomfort. Nancy avoided him, but not in the loud, dramatic way he expected. It was subtle, sharp, professional indifference. In meetings, she refused to acknowledge his ideas. When his name was brought up, her face stayed neutral. She spoke like he didn't exist, like he hadn't once shared her bed, her secrets, her Saturdays. John didn't react. He just did his job, better than expected, faster than most. The more he delivered, the more Brian handed over to him. Soon, John was attending all strategic planning calls, standing in on partner pitches, reviewing financial models. In just 3 weeks, he had moved closer to Brian than Nancy had in 6 months. And she noticed. One afternoon, John walked into the break room to find Nancy already there, pouring oat milk into her mug. She glanced up. Their eyes met. For the first time, neither looked away. "You're really enjoying this, aren't you?" she said. John blinked. "Enjoying what? Climbing over me?" He almost laughed. "Is that what you think this is?" Nancy folded her arms. "I introduced Brian to Carlton last year. I was the one who told him we had untapped distribution models." "You did," John nodded. "And I'm the one optimizing them now." She bit her lip, clearly irritated by his composure. "Brian likes people who deliver," he added, then picked up the coffee pot. "But I suppose you already know that." Nancy's jaw tightened. "You really haven't changed." That one made him pause. He set his cup down. "No, Nancy, I changed the day you left me at that cafe like I was a faulty investment." She looked startled. "You didn't leave because I failed," he continued. "You left because I stopped impressing your friends, because I no longer looked like a man with an upward slope. That's not fair. What's not fair is pretending you were loyal while waiting for an exit." The silence hung between them, sharp and suffocating. Finally, Nancy said quietly, "I thought you needed someone who pushed you." John looked at her. "No, I needed someone who wouldn't walk away the second I stumbled." She turned to leave, but he stopped her with one final line. "And for the record, this isn't revenge, it's just me doing what I've always done, showing up. The difference now is, someone else acted." Willie noticed. 2 days later, the email hit everyone's inbox. Subject: Staff realignment for Q1, product launch. Nancy was being reassigned, shifted from strategy to brand coordination. It was a demotion, a soft one, wrapped in flowery language, but a demotion nonetheless. and Brian had CC'd John on the approval thread. Nancy didn't come to work the next morning. But that wasn't the real conflict. The real conflict started with Ruby. John had known Ruby casually for years, first through mutual industry events, later through a shared contact who always said, "You two would work well together." Ruby was the opposite of Nancy in every way, quiet but direct, warm but no nonsense. She joined the company a week after John. She was hired for data systems, but her ability to untangle chaos had already turned heads. They didn't talk much at first, just polite nods, occasional project overlaps. Until one evening, after everyone else had left, Ruby poked her head into John's office. "You're working too late," she said. "So are you," he replied. She smiled. "Mine's curiosity, yours looks like damage control." He leaned back. "You're not wrong." She hesitated at the door. "Can I ask something?" "Sure." "Is it hard, being here with her?" The question hit harder than he expected, but John didn't flinch. "Some days more than others," he said. "But I didn't come here to get over Nancy, I came here to stop forgetting myself." Ruby walked in then, pulled up a chair, and for the next hour, they talked. Not about strategy or metrics, about the invisible weight of being overlooked. About what loyalty costs when it's not returned. About quiet comebacks. That was the beginning. Over the next week, John started to feel something he hadn't felt in months: ease. With Ruby, there were no games, no staged compliments, no cold calculations. She didn't care what watch he wore or what title he held. She only cared if he listened, and he did. And maybe Nancy saw eye to Nishayan. Because the next Monday, she was back. Nancy returned in full armor, heels higher, tone sharper, eyes colder. She didn't speak to John, didn't acknowledge Ruby, but every move she made was theatrical, every suggestion in meetings was louder than necessary, every laugh, just a few decibels too bright. Brian didn't fall for it, neither did anyone else, but John understood it for what it was: desperation, and with that came something he didn't expect to feel again: pity. Nancy wasn't cruel, she was just unraveling, because for the first time, someone had left her behind, and the worst part, he hadn't even tried to. The final blow came at the end of month team dinner. It was supposed to be informal, celebration drinks for a successful Q1 rollout. Everyone was relaxed, laughter flowing freely, wine glasses clinking. Ruby was seated beside John, Nancy, 2 seats down, mostly silent. At one point, someone asked John how he ended up joining the company. Brian laughed before John could answer. "I stole him, simple as that, saw his memo, knew he was being wasted, made one call." Ruby smiled. "Smart move." Nancy's expression didn't change, but her grip on her glass did. Later that night, as everyone was leaving, Nancy approached John outside. "Did you ever love me?" It wasn't accusatory, it was soft, almost pleading. John looked at her, really looked, her makeup perfect, her smile gone, her pride flickering. "I did," he said. "And now?" He paused. "Now I'm learning what it feels like to be respected." Nancy nodded slowly. "You're still the same man," she whispered. John gave a sad smile. "That's what you never understood. That was never a flaw." John had never been the kind of man to unravel out loud. Even when things hurt, he internalized it, tidy, controlled, managed like spreadsheets. That's how he survived in an industry where mistakes cost jobs and silence earned trust. But after Nancy's question that night, the one she asked with a face full of longing too late, "Did you ever love me?" something cracked beneath the surface. It wasn't the question that shook him, it was that she asked it now, not when he needed her, not when he was drowning, but when she realized he had already learned to breathe without her. That week, John found himself waking up early for no reason, standing in the shower longer than he should, and staring at his ceiling in the dark like it owed him an answer. He wasn't heartbroken. Not exactly. He was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that crawls into your bones after carrying too much silence. Some nights, he replayed everything, from the cafe where she walked out, to the first time Nancy laughed at his dad jokes, to the softness of her voice the night they first made plans for a future. He remembered how she used to grip his hand under the dinner table when she was nervous, how she'd hum when doing dishes, how she once cried quietly during a documentary about forgotten soldiers and said, "Being overlooked is the same as being erased." And yet she did the same to him. He should have been angry, but anger needed fuel, and John had already burned through it. Now, it was just cold reflection. Work didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. The closer Brian brought him to the top-level decisions, the more he found himself in rooms where Nancy wasn't. She was slipping further and further from the professional image she had built, relegated to marketing drafts and vendor calls, and he could feel her watching from the sidelines. Ruby noticed it too. One afternoon, while they walked through a review deck, Ruby quietly said, "You don't need to carry guilt for someone else's choices." John didn't respond at first, then he said, "But what if the guilt isn't about what I did? What if it's about how little it hurts now?" Ruby looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "That's not guilt, John, that's grief leaving your body." He didn't know how to reply, but he carried those words with him. The next weekend, John visited his old neighborhood, the one he and Nancy used to walk through when they were apartment hunting. He passed by the bakery she loved, the tiny bookstore where she once made him buy 3 overpriced poetry books, and the second-floor balcony of the building she used to dream of living in. He stopped outside for a while, watched a couple through the window, arguing, then laughing, then hugging. He realized he didn't want that apartment anymore. He didn't want their life anymore, and that realization felt like losing a limb and finding out you could still walk, but there was still a weight he hadn't let go of. One night, he opened a folder on his laptop. Inside it were dozens of photos, candid shots of Nancy, saved texts, a few voicemails from birthdays and holidays. He hovered over the delete button for a long time. It wasn't nostalgia that stopped him. It was the fear that if he erased those things, it would feel like those 4 years didn't matter. He didn't delete them. He renamed the folder. Closure, do not open. And he never opened it again. Then came the fundraiser. Brian invited the full leadership team to a local non-profit gala, semi-formal, no clients, just internal bonding. Nancy arrived in red, Ruby in navy blue, John wore black. Throughout the night, John watched from the edge of conversations. Nancy moved from group to group, smiling, laughing just a little too loud, her charm strained like an old violin string. Ruby stayed close to John, not clinging, just present, stable. At one point, Nancy walked over. "I heard you're giving a short speech tonight." John nodded. Brian asked, said I'm the dark horse story he wanted to highlight. Nancy smiled tightly. "Fitting, you always did play the long game." John looked at her, searching for the girl who once said she believed in him before he did. But that girl was gone. "You know," she added, "there was a time I wanted us to be here, together, standing on this side of the room." "I know," he said softly. "But you didn't want to wait for it." Nancy looked down. "I didn't know how." He didn't say anything. Then she added, "I never thought I'd be the one left behind." He wanted to tell me neither, but instead, he offered the only kindness he could. "I hope you figure it out." She nodded once and walked away. Ruby stepped beside him a few seconds later. "You okay?" John exhaled. "Getting there." When he gave his speech that night, it wasn't about Nancy, it wasn't even about his comeback. It was about beginnings. "I was once told," he said, "that some people only love you when you're winning. But I've learned that the right people show up when you're not even sure you can get out of bed, and sometimes, the most unexpected people become your reason to stand again." He didn't look at Nancy, he didn't need to. He looked at Ruby. She smiled, and something in him finally, truly, exhaled. The next morning, John made breakfast, not the rushed kind with cereal and cold coffee, but the kind you make when you're no longer carrying someone's silence. He fed his cat, took a walk, called his dad. He even laughed, out loud, at a stupid meme Ruby sent him. He wasn't over everything, not yet, but he was no longer standing still, and for the first time in a long time, John realized something simple but powerful. He didn't miss Nancy. He missed being seen, and now, someone was actually looking. Brian rarely sent company-wide emails on a Sunday, so when John's phone buzzed at 8:12 a.m. with a message marked, "Urgent, internal notice," he sat up in bed, heart already sinking. The subject line was vague, leadership realignment, but the attachment told the real story. Nancy had submitted her resignation, effective immediately. No farewell message, no exit interview scheduled, no transition plan, just a 2-line statement confirming she was stepping away to pursue new opportunities. John stared at the screen for a long time, reading it 3 times before setting the phone down. He didn't feel relieved, he felt unsettled. This wasn't how she operated. Nancy didn't walk away from anything unless she had something bigger lined up. She fought for attention, influence, optics, yet this time, she'd gone silent, too silent. That afternoon, Ruby called. "I assume you saw the announcement," she said. "I did. I also assume you've been thinking about it for the last 6 hours." John exhaled. "That obvious?" Ruby didn't laugh. Her tone was quieter than usual. "I think something happened, something we haven't seen." He was already thinking the same. On Monday, HR confirmed the basics. Nancy had cleared out her desk before anyone arrived, left behind only a potted plant and a branded coffee mug. The access badge deactivated, her company email was archived. But what caught John off guard wasn't her absence, it was what she'd taken with her. The marketing server. She hadn't stolen it, but before leaving, she had deleted every draft, every visual file, every approved campaign asset she'd been working on for the last 4 months. Nothing critical, just enough to derail the Q2 rollout. She left the team scrambling. Brian didn't say much publicly, but the tension was undeniable. Later that week, John got called into his office. "You two were close once," Brian said. "It wasn't a question." John nodded. "A while ago." "Any idea why she'd do this?" John shook his head. "She was frustrated, maybe she wanted to burn the bridge." Brian didn't reply for a moment, then he leaned forward. "There's more." He slid a printed screenshot across the desk. It was from a Reddit thread, a post titled "Dark Truth Behind Startup Culture, Exposing Brian Liu's Puppet Hires." The tone was bitter, laced with accusations of favoritism, toxic culture, and misogyny. John scanned the post. His name appeared 5 times. All of it framed him as the problem. Nancy hadn't signed the post, but the details, they were too personal to be a guess. "Damn," John muttered. "She posted it from a burner," Brian said, "but we traced it back to her apartment's IP address." John looked up. "So what happens now?" Brian folded his hands. "We've got legal options, but that's not why I called you in." "Then why?" Brian tilted his head. "Because I want you to lead the damage control, public, internal, and product-facing. I want people to see that you're not the man she painted you to be, not through words, through execution." John blinked. "You're giving me the reins?" "You've earned them," Brian said. "Now show them who you are." That night, John didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with a blank notebook and a glass of something stronger than usual. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, betrayal. He had been prepared for resentment, competition, even bitterness. But not this, not sabotage disguised as anonymous truth. Nancy had done the one thing he thought she never would, she'd tried to ruin his name. And what hurt more than the attack was how well she knew where to aim. She hadn't lied in the post, she had just twisted things slightly, enough to spark doubt without ever stepping into fiction. Every detail she'd shared came from years of private conversations, from moments he thought were safe. She took his silence and turned it into aloofness, his humility into weakness, his ability to move on into cold ambition. And people believed her. Or at least, they wanted to. Because scandal always sells louder than consistency. Over the next week, John did what he did best. He worked. He stepped into the rollout leadership position, rebuilt every missing file, reassigned tasks, restructured team workflows, and pulled in Ruby as his right hand. They worked late nights, but there was no tension, just quiet synergy. Ruby never brought up the post, she never asked how he felt. But once, as they were cleaning up after a pitch review, she placed a paper bag on his desk. Inside was a jar of herbal tea. "For focus," she said, "and because you need to sleep eventually." John smiled. "You know me too well. I know what tired eyes look like." They stood there for a moment, not speaking, just breathing in the quiet. Finally, John said, "I thought I'd buried it, that whole part of my life, but somehow, she's still writing new endings." Ruby looked at him gently. "Then it's time you write one yourself." The second twist wasn't that Nancy tried to hurt him. It was that he no longer wanted to hurt her back. He didn't call her, he didn't confront her, he didn't clap back online. Instead, he prepared a press release for the Q2 campaign featuring 3 core themes: resilience, authenticity, and moving forward with clarity. He didn't sign it alone, he signed it with Ruby. The campaign went live, the backlash faded. People stopped talking about the Reddit post, they started talking about results. Nancy faded from the narrative, and that, in the end, was the twist she never saw coming. Because the worst kind of revenge is when they realize they didn't matter to your rise at all. The quarterly board meeting wasn't meant to be dramatic, just numbers, strategy, projections. John had reviewed the deck 3 times the night before, polished his slides, fine-tuned the final narrative. He had everything under control. Until Nancy showed up. She wasn't on the invite list, wasn't a stakeholder, wasn't even an employee anymore. But there she was, standing at the back of the glass conference room, wearing black, arms folded, eyes scanning the room like she still belonged in it. John saw her just before the presentation began. He said nothing, gave no reaction. Clicked through his slides and laid out the future of the company with a steadiness that didn't break. But his thoughts fractured around her presence, splintering into sharp edges he couldn't ignore. Nancy didn't interrupt, didn't speak. She just stared at him like she was waiting for something, perhaps for him to stumble, to trip, to prove her right. But John didn't. He finished the presentation, got a standing nod from 2 board members, a quite impressive from the CFO, and a smile from Brian that said, "You've arrived." Only once the room began to empty did Nancy make her move. She waited until only John and Ruby remained. Ruby was closing her laptop, ready to leave. Nancy stepped forward. "Can I speak to you?" she asked John, voice clipped but low. Ruby glanced at John. He nodded once. She gave Nancy a quick look, blank, unreadable, then left without a word. Now it was just the 2 of them. "I didn't come here to make a scene," Nancy said, walking to the edge of the conference table. "You already did," John replied, calm but unflinching. She sighed. "I didn't expect the post to blow up the way it did." John raised an eyebrow. "You mean the post you made anonymously, from your own apartment, about me being a puppet hire?" Nancy's shoulders dropped, her bravado dissolving like cheap paint in rain. "It was stupid, I was angry, I was humiliated." "No," John said. "You were irrelevant. That's what really scared you." She winced. "I didn't expect you to become this." "Stable? Respected?" he asked. "Wanted?" Nancy flinched again. John leaned forward slightly, but his voice never rose. "You tried to write my downfall as if it was a plot twist in your life, but I wasn't a character in your story anymore, Nancy." She looked at him with something almost close to regret. "I thought you'd hate me." "I did," he admitted. "Then I pitied you. Now I just don't think of you." Her lip twitched. Whether it was pain or pride trying to break through, even she didn't seem to know. "I guess I came back to say I'm sorry." John stood still, eyes steady. "I'm not the man who needed that. He's gone." For a moment, the silence grew too heavy. Then Nancy whispered, "Do you love her?" John didn't ask who. He didn't need to. "I trust her," he said. "That's more than I ever had with you." Nancy closed her eyes. "I hope she's worth it," she said, voice trembling. "I hope you don't wake up one day and realize she only saw your rise, not your struggle." John looked at her, finally letting a quiet sadness show. "She saw my struggle when it didn't benefit her. She stood beside me when there was nothing to gain. That's the difference." Nancy nodded slowly. "I see that now." Then she turned to leave. And John let her go, without another word. Later that night, Ruby found him sitting outside the office building, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, eyes fixed on the skyline. She didn't speak, just sat beside him. After a few minutes, he said, "She came back, said sorry." Ruby nodded once. "Did it help?" John thought for a moment. "I thought it would, but it didn't, because I realized I don't need closure from her. I already found it in the way you looked at me when I had nothing." Ruby smiled, small and soft. "You don't owe her anything," she said, "least of all your peace." John turned to her. "And you?" "I don't need anything," Ruby replied, "but I'd like to be there if you'll let me." John's voice caught for a second, then he said, "Stay." She didn't move closer, she didn't lean in for a kiss, she just stayed, exactly as she was, and for once, that was enough. The next morning, Brian called John into his office again. "I heard about your visitor." "I handled it," John said simply. "You always do," Brian replied, then he slid a folder across the desk. "You've earned this." John opened it. It was a promotion offer, Senior VP of Strategy and Development. Effective immediately. He looked up, stunned. "I thought we'd revisit it at year-end," he said. "We were going to," Brian replied. "But the way you carried the company through a scandal you didn't cause, the way you rebuilt a brand overnight, the way you made people believe again, that deserves more than patience." John stared at the document. 4 years ago, he wouldn't have dreamed of this. 3 years ago, he was invisible. 2 years ago, discarded. 6 months ago, I was replaced. Now? Now, he was irreplaceable. He signed the offer letter. And this time, when he walked out of Brian's office, he didn't carry doubt. He carried momentum. That evening, he stood in his apartment, unpacking a delivery box. A new coffee machine, something he'd always told himself was too expensive to justify. But today, he felt like a man who could buy himself something without guilt. As he placed it on the counter, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "I saw the promotion, congratulations, I mean that." "Nancy," he didn't reply. Not because he was angry, but because silence was no longer a prison, it was power. An hour later, Ruby arrived with dinner. She stepped inside, noticed the coffee machine, and laughed. "Finally investing in your vices?" "Figured I'd stop treating myself like a liability," John said, handing her a cup. They sat on the couch, eating takeout, watching a movie neither of them paid much attention to. Halfway through, Ruby said, "I was scared when I first saw you in the office, thought you might be another man dragging his past into the present." John smiled faintly. "And now?" "Now I see someone who buried the past, and you said it as fertilizer." He chuckled. "That's graphic. But accurate." He turned toward her, more serious now. "Thank you, Ruby, for staying quiet when I needed it, and for speaking when I didn't know how." She didn't reply. She just leaned her head on his shoulder. And for the first time since he'd been fired, for the first time since he'd been abandoned, accused and betrayed, John closed his eyes and felt full. Not victorious, not vindicated, just whole. It wasn't revenge when John rose, it was routine. It was every quiet morning he showed up before the rest of the team. Every calm decision under pressure. Every strategy drafted late at night while others scrolled endlessly. It wasn't vengeance that lifted him, it was discipline. But when his old name reappeared in a different setting, that's when it turned. 6 weeks after his promotion, John received an email from the corporate vetting team. They were reviewing a strategic partnership proposal submitted by a boutique PR firm that had recently acquired a viral micro agency. The firm's founder, Nancy. She had rebranded herself. Gone were the flashy posts and startup energy. Now it was all minimalist decks, clean branding, and buzzwords like reputation pivot and narrative recalibration. The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman who once tried to ruin his reputation was now selling herself as someone who could protect it for others. John didn't respond immediately. Instead, he forwarded the proposal to Ruby. Attached a one-line message. "Want to help me close one final door?" A week later, Brian scheduled an internal review meeting. Nancy was invited. She had no idea who requested the call. She walked in with the same polished poise she always used when pretending nothing cracked beneath the surface. Her eyes scanned the table and landed on John. She froze for only a second, but it was enough. He was seated at the head of the table. She wasn't. Nancy cleared her throat. "Nice to see familiar faces again." John returned a small, professional smile. "Let's begin." She presented her case well. Clean slides, confident tone, carefully rehearsed sentences. But the moment her final slide faded out, John spoke. "You're offering crisis management solutions," he said. "But I have a few questions about your last one." He opened a folder. Inside were printed screenshots of the Reddit post, side-by-side comparisons with her internal writing samples, Metadata. He placed them gently on the table. Nancy's face paled. That was never... John didn't raise his voice. He didn't glare. He just asked one question. Would you hire someone who tried to destroy your company's leadership from the shadows? Silence. Nancy sat still, lips parted. Breathe shallow. Brian looked at her. We won't be moving forward with this partnership. Nancy turned to John, eyes wide. You set this up. He leaned forward. No, Nancy, you did. The day you posted that thread, you lit a fire under the wrong man's name. You didn't think I'd rise. You never expected I'd be sitting in the room where you now beg for access. She tried to compose herself. You've made your point. John gave a faint nod. No, I proved mine. He stood and walked out. She never worked with any company affiliated with Brian's network again. Within 3 months, her firm dissolved. That was the last time John saw her. And he didn't look back. He didn't need to. Because by then, the revenge wasn't about rage, it was about reclaiming silence, owning dignity, taking back control of the narrative, and letting someone choke on the weight of what they thought was forgettable. At the company's year-end gala, John was awarded Executive of the Year. He gave a short speech, simple, unemotional, but one line lingered with everyone who heard it. Sometimes, the people who bury you forget you were a seed. Applause. Brian raised a toast. Ruby stood beside him, glass in hand, eyes proud. Later that night, as the music faded and the crowd thinned, she and John walked out onto the balcony. Cold air, city lights, peace. You finally buried the ghost, Ruby said. John looked out over the skyline. No, I didn't bury it, I let it starve. She leaned into him, her voice softer now. Do you think she regrets it? John shrugged. Maybe, but I don't care, because I don't live in her memory anymore. Ruby smiled. So, where do you live now? John turned to her. In mine. 6 months later, John launched his own division, one focused on ethical reputation management and leadership recovery strategies. He built it with Ruby. Handpicked every hire, created policies to protect employees from smear campaigns, digital betrayal, and silent sabotage. His first keynote speech was titled, Silence as a Strategy, What They Never Teach You About Being Underrated. He never mentioned Nancy by name. But everyone who knew him knew exactly what he meant. And one early morning, as the city yawned awake, John sat on his balcony, coffee in hand, scrolling past news about a failed PR firm with unpaid taxes and a messy public record. He didn't click it. Didn't need to. He took a sip, glanced at his phone, and opened a voice note from Ruby. The vendor contracts are approved. Also, the coffee beans we ordered finally arrived. You better learn how to grind them. No shortcuts. We're too successful to drink average coffee now. He smiled, then replied, I'll grind it, like I ground the last chapter of my life down to dust. Across the city, Nancy stared at an empty inbox. She hadn't received a single business inquiry in weeks. The ghost of a name she once tried to erase had become a legend. And hers? Forgotten. She scrolled through LinkedIn. John's photo appeared, smiling, speaking on a panel, captioned, one of the most respected crisis strategists of the year. She didn't cry. Just closed the app, shut the laptop, sat in the silence she created for herself. And for the first time, she realized. He didn't need to punish her. He just needed to become someone she could never touch again.